Okay, sensory problems. What are those? A person that is on the spectrum will generally have different types of sensory-related issues. To us, it may be charming and it's super soft, 3 rolls, 3 plies together, it's the greatest thing in the world. To them, it may look just like that. That's what a sensory issue is to them. It's how they perceive or interact with an item relative to what it is to them. Sensory issues are actually developed and we really don't know yet where they come from. We know that they are part of the genetic code of the person, but for some reason they have some sort of adverse reaction to certain items or to certain things. So to give you absolutely, it comes from the basal ganglia of the brain, we don't know yet. But we do know that sensory issues are important to recognize when treating children. Why is that? Because a sensory issue can never, ever be modified as a behavior. It is part of who their disposition is as a person. And once you understand that that's a core disposition of who they are, it's important to recognize that you can help regulate it, but you can never change it. So sensory behaviors are challenges in which the child or the adult deals with taking and processing and responding to different sensations. Okay, each child has different patterns in which they respond and make sense to different sensations. If you take an autistic child to Walmart, what are some of the risks that you take? Well, I guess if you take any child to Walmart, you take risks, right? They might take off running, right? Why would they? And you're absolutely right. Why could that happen? Overstimulation, beautiful example. If you look up and you look at the fluorescent lights, they run at a certain gauge. Some children will see these as nightclub lights. So to them, you turn these on and it's like they're looking at strobe lights. It would drive them crazy. But yet you give them a laptop which doesn't flicker, they're perfectly happy. So they have a visual sensory issue. And it's about knowing and beginning to recognize and understanding the difference between sensory and non-sensory issue. And again, I apologize. I know that I only have a couple hours, so I wish I could go so much more in depth with this rather than just an overview. It's the way that their sensations are taken in, processed, and responded to. A lot of times you may have a child react a certain way if you do a certain thing. For example, if you go hug a child and you happen to be wearing a silk shirt that day, you may find that the child turns around and, if I may, go, wow, and start all of a sudden playing with your shirt. And then it doesn't matter where you go, the child's following you to play with that shirt because they like the sensation of silk. Yet you may have a cotton shirt that you hug the child with, and on the seam of your shirt, it has stitches that are very pronounced. And when they rub against the child's arm, they feel the stitches and then they inadvertently pull away from you. If you aren't aware that those are potentially sensory issues, you might actually do an intervention and say, okay, you're being bad. You should allow me to hug you. And not realize it has nothing to do with the hugging, but the actual sensory-related item. Does that make sense? So it's, again, becoming aware that these types of things exist. So let's just look at a second for visual input. Some sensories that are vision, you'll see them stare at spinning objects. You'll see them spin their own bodies. Anyone ever seen body spinning before? Yep, again, it's a form of a coping mechanism that they use to regulate their connections through the synapses to turn opposite direction from where the teacher's lecturing. Again, it could be a visual thing or it could be an auditory thing, and we'll talk about those in a second. The demand to wear sunglasses indoors. Temple Grandin, have you guys ever heard of her? She had a fascinating story. She was a young autistic girl, and they have a movie about her. If you haven't seen it, definitely make time to go see the movie Temple Grandin. She's fantastic. And Temple Grandin, and she was a young child. Have you guys seen the movie? It's fantastic, isn't it? It gives you a whole different perspective into this world. She was a young girl who had been diagnosed with autism, and this was going back into the 50s. So naturally, they wanted to institutionalize her. They wanted to put her away because there was nothing they could do for her. So the mother was very diligent, found her some form of behavioral therapy, got her to where she needed to be. And today she's a PhD, and she actually goes and lectures out on how to deal with autism, what are some of the functioning aspects of autism. as well as she specialized in the cattle industry. And what she found is that she had this innate talent because some autistics are very analytical and they look at things from a perspective of structure, they like consistency, and they like numeric values to things. So she was able to almost do the entire United States industry when it comes to cattle and how they actually were taken through the slaughter mills. Because what happened is they found a lot of the cattle would fight, would drown, and there was a loss of money because cattle would drown. So she created and invented all these new different things based off of the autistic mind and helped them become significantly more productive. Amazing, amazing movie. It's a couple of hours, but it's worth you sitting down and getting a really good perspective. Thank you guys for recommending that. I appreciate that. And again, the story goes back to she was talking about a child that she was working with. And this particular child, the mother would take into Walmart, and the child would have an absolute fit. Didn't want to be in there, wanted nothing to do with Walmart, absolutely did not work for the child. Child would throw a fit, mom could never really go out. So Dr. Grandin said, how about you do this? How about you go to Walmart and go into the little glasses section where they have all the sunglasses and let them pick a pair of sunglasses to put on. So the child went, of course, kicking and screaming at first, went into the area where all the sunglasses were, got a pair of sunglasses, put them on, and guess what it did? It minimized the visual input, which limited the sensory issues that the child had. Now they spend 2 to 3 hours in Walmart shopping with no problem. Again, it's understanding when it's a sensory-related issue versus a behavioral issue. That is one of the key, most important components of dealing with anybody on the spectrum. Having the distinction, knowing the distinction between the two. An extremely organized or unorganized room is what you'll see with visual input. Now, what are some of the interventions that are recommended? Limit the amount of visual material hanging from walls or ceilings. Again, an autistic person may have an issue with how this room is built because it's not flat and there's openings. So with the beams, they may have some discomfort when it comes to, I don't like it. It helps me feel uncomfortable. It's not predictable, so I don't know when that beam will fall, and they will actually calculate for you the angles of the beam. So it's really kind of interesting when you deal with that. Manipulatives inside containers. Again, my neighbor, which had the bucket of water, was really interesting because they looked at the bucket of water, and to him, he was like, well, why does he like water so much? And then we began to realize that was a regulatory thing for him. And it was a regulatory thing for him because there were other elements that he was having to deal with by going outside that he didn't like dealing with. For example, being under the tree that was over him that was constantly blowing by the wind, to him was a visual sensory issue because he could not show the prediction of the tree. So all of a sudden, this was my comfort. If I'm in here, I know it's predictable. I know I have to hold my breath. And I control how long I hold my breath versus the tree controlling me as to when it's going to fall. So again, it's understanding the difference in that. Organize and label all material to identify where they belong. Put pictures on containers for students if they have any sort of visual memory. Templates, and tape a number or a letter line on the student's desk. You'll see this a lot in school districts and within schools. And it's often very obvious to those of you guys that are trained with this. When you walk into a classroom, if it's an all-inclusive, you'll immediately know where the autistic children sit or those on the spectrum because they will have some sort of taping on their desk. It can be a picture, it can be a number, it can be some sort of visual cue. And what that cue tells the child is, okay, we are in period number 1, which is reading, so they recognize 1 for reading. So they know at that particular time that is part of their consistent schedule. So they want to make sure, wait a minute, it says 1 and we're doing PE, no. And then that's when you're going to have the behavior come out. Now it's not a sensory issue anymore because now the behavior's being caused because of the inconsistency in the schedule, but the visual cue will help regulate for the child when that's actually taking place. Okay, let's go into the auditory, which is a great segue. So covers ears for a fire drill when the class is loud. Talk about ironic that we asked that question at this time, right? Runs from a loud area or complains of noises in the room outside of the windows, the lawnmower, heater blow, insects, students writing on paper. Here's an interesting, this is a child that lives directly under the flight path on the San Antonio airport. So what's interesting is you can see the child outside go, wow, here's this, UPS Boeing 737 coming down with these massive engines, loud as can be, and the kid is just completely under looking at it, amazed. But the minute the neighbor turns on the lawnmower, where do you think the child goes? Running inside, right? So again, some sensory-related items are going to affect some, and some are not going to affect some. So you may have another child on the spectrum that comes out, sees the Boeing 737, and completely gets scared and runs inside or runs, under the porch area, but the lawnmower doesn't scare them. What's most important is when you work with a child that's on the spectrum, we have to realize there's no one specific treatment for all. Each child is individual, and each child will require an individualized plan to help them work through whatever issues it is that they have. So if you come across someone that says, well, I have the perfect kit that will help, be skeptical. Ask a lot of questions about this perfect kit, because every single person on the spectrum is different. There's no two that are generally the same. Complains of noises inside of the room or outside of the window, covers ears in the cafeteria, cannot go into the gym where there are many people in it, the sound of the basketball. That alone could be enough to trigger. Now imagine if the child has a tactile sensory issue, a visual issue, and an auditory issue. You throw him the basketball, he grabs it, doesn't like the sensation of the ball, doesn't like to hear the ball bouncing, and is very uncomfortable with the height of the basketball, of the gymnasium. We got some crazy behavior that's going to come out of that, right? Of course, if we're not attuned to this behavior, what do we think it is? Well, the child doesn't want to play, he's being difficult, doesn't actually want to be incorporated into all these activities, so we need to punish the child. And don't realize that it's part of their sensory core, not so much the behavioral aspect. So what are some things that are done for the auditory? Minimize verbal directions. Those are the kids, again, you're going to see a lot of the cue cards, not only for consistency, but they work off of visualizations, how things work from a visual perspective. You'll also see this pretty often with children that are nonverbal. They work through visuals to help them understand their day-to-day. Use earplugs or headphones. Here's an interesting example. I had a child that could not stand loud noises. So they bought him, and the parents named this the Star Wars magical headset that would protect him. So they put the Star Wars magical headset when these loud noises came on. And the child was running around perfectly normal, absolutely happy. They were really those real expensive Bose headsets. Over time, they started turning the volume down of that loud noise, which was the stereo of their daughter upstairs. As they turned the volume down little by little and by little, the child started realizing right before they put them on, well, I don't hear that anymore. And it was, again, a progression that they slowly took, and eventually the child stopped using them, and the radio slowly started being controlled because the child got introduced to the stereo and was able to manipulate the volume. Again, it's another way of understanding that these items exist. Allow time for students to listen to favorite music, using more visuals or pictures, and use social stories, what might happen where the sound is actually heard in the room. Social stories are extremely important for children on the spectrum. It helps them cognitively understand items before they happen. So what does that do for them? It creates predictability. When it creates that predictability for them, it makes sense to them now when it happens. Outside of that, it's pure shock. They're not sure where they're going with this, so they're kind of confused. When they have a sense of predictability, it helps stabilize their mood, it helps stabilize themselves, and it creates less of a behavioral disruption. Again, it's understanding the sensory. Okay, so let's go into tactile. Throwing arms back while being picked up by adults, pulls away when trying to hold the child's hand. Now, let's say that you see a parent with a child. The child is not on the spectrum, and the parent goes to grab the child's hand at Walmart, and the child pulls the hand away and starts walking the opposite way. Does that categorize him as being on the spectrum or having a sensory issue? No, not necessarily, right? I mean, a lot of kids do that. So how do you know if it's a tactile sensory issue then? Kind of a good question, right? It's like, well, how do I define that thing? Let's say the child has never had any kind of diagnostic done, so we don't know if they're autistic or not. They have some of the general tendencies, but not all the features. Well, one of the most important things that we can do as professionals is manage data. And here's what I mean by that. If you notice a trend in a child's behavior, start trending it over a period of time, whether it's daily, weekly, monthly, and then you'll be amazed as to how that behavior starts becoming predictable. As that behavior starts becoming predictable, you can then in turn say, this is a form of an escape contingency or an avoidance contingency because of X, Y, or Z. So now you have an idea like, okay, it makes sense why the child does this. Here's a good example. if you have a child and they're going to school in the morning, and you'll notice that for whatever reasons, Monday morning and Friday morning, they tend to get sick, or they get really angry, or they have a headache. And you start asking yourself, wow, I never really took data on this before, but now I'm realizing it's always on Monday and Friday. So then you start investigating some of the data a little bit, and you begin to realize when you go to the school and say, hey, what happens on Monday and Friday? Oh, those are PE days outside. Oh. And then the child does not like to put on tennis shoes because it's a sensory-related issue. They don't like the feeling on their feet. And we go even further to find out that maybe the school hadn't notified us yet, but there's also a bully picking on the child because he's not social and he stays in the corner by himself. Can you see how all of it builds up through the managing of the information and the data? But outside of that, if we don't do that, we might make assumptions as to why the child may be behaving in this particular manner. So again, it's by really looking at all the elements that are contributors to truly finding out. Always hanging on an adult or laying between his box spring and regular mattress. Again, it's about pressure. Avoids touching certain surfaces, textures, certain fabrics, dislikes getting their hands or their feet messy. When you look at this movie, Temple Grandin, she does an amazing job of talking about how an autistic person, for her, when she had a really bad experience with someone, she created a pressure machine. And this machine was actually created by watching cattle. Right before you see cattle be moved into slaughter, they go into the chute, and the chute closes on them, and it pressurizes them so they can't move. Well, she saw that, and she thought, that's interesting. And she found a way to make the cattle feel comfortable when they did that because they stopped moving. They were very relaxed. So she went and created her own machine and realized her sensory tactile issue, when she had pressure applied to her, just like that machine, it didn't matter how egregious the issue was that she was dealing with, it put her totally at ease. So she created this as a form of dealing with her sensory issue. Again, just another example of how certain people will do certain things, and the box spring really talks to that example here. Specific fabrics we kind of talked a little bit about up here and how that may integrate into a sensory issue, getting hands or feet messy. Tactile interventions. When a student says a touch hurts or pulls away, acknowledges their pain and stops touching, here's something to look at. Experiment with types of clothing that are comfortable. Sometimes the kids, you can buy them regular Hanes, and they have to wear them inside out because the stitching is on the inside, and that bothers them, but if you flip them over where the stitching's on the outside now, they're perfectly happy. It's about regulating, again, the sensory-related items. Providing easy access to small hand fidgets. Texture, softballs, little squeegee things, all those kinds of things that are of importance to them. Use them as a reward system. It satisfies a sensory issue that they may have. Again, be careful when you're using items for reward systems. You can very quickly find that you are supporting behaviors that are maladaptive behaviors versus adaptive behaviors, and quickly you can develop somebody through the sensory issues that is completely functioning in an inappropriate way, which is quote-unquote how society says is inappropriate. So you have to be careful with that. Always recommend that you go and speak to an occupational therapist when it comes to tactile-related issues, sensory-related issues. They're really the experts that know how to deal with this. Talk to your developmental pediatrician as well. This is a fantastic resource here that you can come to and communicate with the clinicians here so they can actually work with you on seeing what some of the related issues are before you actually go to a behaviorist. Okay, non-sensory behaviors. Well, arguing with parents. Sensory, what do you think? Probably not, otherwise we'd all have sensory issues, right? Yelling at others, hitting other individuals, being disrespectful, throwing themselves on the floor. Again, beginning to recognize the difference between the two is going to be key. Once you begin to recognize the two, then you can start understanding how to better deal with the type of behavior that is being manifested by the child.